You're listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast.
You're listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast. My name is Shawn Wilkie, and along with my awesome co-host, we interview the innovators in this space every week. Super excited to introduce a friend today. Ivan, please go ahead and get us started.
I'm Ivan Zach, and I am excited to introduce a friend of mine, Stacy Pursell. She is a celebrity in the recruiting world of veterinary medicine. She's a founder and CEO of the Vet Recruiter and is an internationally respected executive search consultant in Veterinary Recruiter. With 25 years of experience, she is a talent scout and workforce expert who helps build world-class animal health and veterinary industry organizations. Ranked in the top 1% of search consultants worldwide, Stacy helped organizations of all sizes throughout the United States, Canada, and abroad locate, recruit, and hire the best talent for their specific needs. Stacy, welcome to the show. It's great to see you again.
Well, thank you so much, Ivan, and thank you, Shawn. And wow, Ivan, thank you for that kind intro. You're making me blush when you say celebrity status.
Well, if someone knows how to recruit people in our domain, that's you. But this is an incredible topic because it's very much intertwined with what we are trying to do in researching the burnout and just decrease the burnout, and which is the burden on our industry, and creating this high demand and low supply industry. So, how has the last couple years changed what you do, and how difficult it is now to recruit veterinary staff, veterinarians, and technicians? I know that. Well, I don't know if you go into that level, but I think that you're executives and the veterinarian. So, how difficult is that?
Yes. So the Vet Recruiter, we primarily focus on executive search and placing veterinarians. We don't place technicians and we don't often place practice managers. So we're focusing on the veterinarians and the industry side, executive search. So the Great Resignation, the last 2 years have been, like you said, very difficult to hire and retain employees. And one of the things that has made it more difficult is the Great Resignation. I'm sure most people that are listening have heard of the Great Resignation. Also, another point is during the past several years, the job hopping stigma has disappeared. In the past, when people had several jobs in a short period of time, that was considered job hopping. But now people change jobs every 18 to 24 months. That's more normal. And according to a recent survey conducted by the Muse of more than 2,500 millennial and Gen Z workers, 80% of those surveyed believe that it's okay to leave a job in 6 months. So this has contributed to this because not only are you having difficulty hiring people, but you're also having difficulty retaining them. So what we've done is we've had to just really work harder and get smarter about everything that we're doing. Another report that came out, Microsoft Work Trend Index released a report on March 16th of this year that said that 43% of employees are somewhat or extremely likely to consider changing jobs in the upcoming year, which is slightly year over year from 41%. And then 52% of Gen Z and millennial respondents said that they will change jobs in the year ahead. So that's up 3% since last year. And by comparison, 35% of Gen X and baby boomers said that they're considering a job change right now.
Wow. So I hopped in the last cart of the millennial train, or the first one, whichever way you put it, and I don't remember holding a job more than a year myself. So maybe that's the symptom, or I just don't like working for others. That also might be the reason. So what do we do? What can we do with this? Because recruiting fees, I heard people, with bonuses, sign up things, paying for loans, giving the house down payments, giving a car on, like, all of that stuff is happening right now in veterinary medicine. And the recruiting fees can go with all those bonuses, anywhere between 25 to $100,000, I heard. And then if you hire someone for that much money and then they leave within 6 months, what can practices do? Or what do you look in the practices for the veterinarians to stay longer than that? And how are the veterinarians motivated today to stay longer?
Well, you're right. It is expensive to hire and retain, and the price of everything is going up. And inflation is all over the news right now. Salaries are increasing. I don't even think I've seen a veterinarian get a salary for less than 100,000 in the last 18 months. We're hearing stories of new graduates getting salaries of 130, and I've even heard of 150,000. Right out of school with no experience, but so the question is, from the employer perspective, what do you do? Well, it starts with the hiring process. So talk about engagement, you have to effectively engage candidates by focusing first on their pain points and then selling all aspects of the job and the opportunity overall. So once you sell them, you successfully hire them, you land them in your organization, then the employer has to deliver on everything that you promised them during the hiring process. So this is called the validation of experience. So if the promises that were made to them before being hired are not reflected in their experience as an employee after being hired, then they are an immediate flight risk, and then it will be more difficult to keep them long term. For example, one of our candidates was hired by one of our clients, and he was hired to work at a certain location near his home. And then upon hire, they had a veterinarian resign at a location 45 minutes from his house. So they asked him to go work at that location. And he didn't want to drive 45 minutes each way every day back and forth to work. So he was thinking about resigning a job he had just started. So we talked with our client and they moved him back to the original location. So, as an employer, if you do something like that, then the person you just hired is at risk of leaving the position they just started.
That's incredible. Yeah, I mean, there's so many challenges, and I think I'd like to double click on these signing bonuses. I was just at a vet show in Chicago, and there was a full page ad by one of the veterinary consolidators with $100,000 signing bonuses. Do these work? And how often are things like this happening in the industry, Stacy?
They can work. They can also not work. And so, really, it all goes back to and I'll touch on that here in a second, but it all goes back to the company culture because the company culture is a major factor in which today's candidates choose. And it's also a big factor in terms of their validation of experience. So, the important point to consider in regards to employer branding and company culture is if you brand yourself a certain way to candidates, then you must back it up with a company culture that is full and accurate of your branding efforts. So, a big concern to candidates these days is a work life balance. People work to live, they don't live to work. And they're also concerned about health and wellness, and they want to work for employers who are going to provide a healthy work environment. For example, we saw a veterinary practice that was not allowing the veterinarians to take a lunch or have any breaks during the day. And their doctors were leaving, and the practice owner didn't understand why. And that was one of the reasons he was losing people, was because it was not a healthy culture. So if you pay somebody a sign-on bonus of 100,000 and then they get there and they're in a terrible culture, they're at a flight risk. And I talked to a candidate in the last year who had taken a sign on bonus, and she got to her employer and it was a terrible culture. She actually borrowed money from her parents to pay back the sign on bonus so that she could leave and go to work somewhere else. On the other hand, we are seeing sign on bonuses attract people. Just yesterday, I had a conversation with a client of ours, and he's offering a $250,000 retention bonus if a veterinarian will come on board and stay for 3 years
Oh my gosh.
because he's planning to sell to a corporation in 3 years. And so he needs to build up his practice. So if somebody will join and stay for 3 years, when they sell to the corporation, he's going to give them 250,000. He said possibly more if they're a high producer.
And
Wow.
that's, that doesn't surprise me because if you look at the multiple that they're getting on it, so if you're very simple, if you're a one man show, you can't sell to corporate unless you're selling to Galaxy because we talk to those people. That's a shameless plug. But then no, most consolidators are concerned about having a single vet practice because they can't hire anybody. So this is where it becomes a dilemma. If you want to sell your practice, then you need to get another associate to get the multiple as a two, or at least get an exit, and then get a multiple as a two vet practice. Now, poor consolidator that buys that clinic because that's the only thing potentially that's holding that person there. That's 250 bonus, and then once they're sold the clinic, then the
Out
yep,
the door.
and there could be the holdback on the seller, but not on the associate, and then associate gets paid, and then the seller will have a holdback. That anyway, there's a lot of probably caveats to that. Also, a lot of small print. I'm sure that it says big letters, $100,000 sign up bonus, and then there's a lot of associated with it. So there's potentially a small print of what do you need to do to receive this $100,000, or what is the attachment to that. So then then the person has to go back and borrow money from their parents. That's kind of that's kind of sad to hear. So Stacy, I'm gonna throw a curveball here. So right now there's several platforms that are starting to do recruitment, mostly in the sort of the temporary relief space. Do you see that becoming a competition to you? Is digital world taking over the traditional recruiters and the recruiting companies like yours, or do they complement? Do they compete with you? How does that work?
I think that there's a space for everyone. I've been recruiting since 1997. So starting in August, I'll be beginning my 26th year. And this will always be a people business. It will always be about, your network, influence. Really, the number one thing that recruiters do is influence. Technology is great. It's a great tool, but technology cannot always influence somebody to do something. When I got started in recruiting in the late 1990s, it was in 1997, job boards started coming out. So funny story, there were people in my office that were still working there in executive search that were there before email and fax machines. And so back in that day, they'd get a candidate, they'd put the resume in an envelope, they'd mail it to the client, wait 3 or 4 days for the client to get the resume. When I started, it was the fax machine. We would fax the resumes. And then after that, we got email. We would email the resumes. And then after that came the job boards at monster.com. And, recruiters were worried that monster.com was going to replace the executive recruiting space. The executive recruiting space is a multi-billion-dollar business. I don't think it's going to be replaced by technology. I think technology is going to complement it, but I don't think it's going to go anywhere because it's always going to be a people business. And like I said, again, the number one thing that companies hire recruiters do is to influence, and that takes having a conversation with an individual about their career and about an opportunity that has the potential to advance their career forward.
So the technology comes and goes, and Stacy stays. So that's the let's go back to the culture piece. How can veterinarians, because most of the time people are looking, everybody's talking about culture, but for the most part, people are looking, what's my pay, what's my CE allowance, what's my this, what's my sign up bonus. Do veterinarians pay attention to culture when they're getting a job, or they're focusing on the reward, monetary reward, and then they end up in a bad culture and they realize that this is not an environment they want to work in? And what is your advice to veterinarians that are looking for a job? How do they test for culture? How do you form a culture that you want to be in your mindset, and how do you test for that? Because culture is not something that is good or bad. Everybody just has a different, environment they want to work in. So what would you advise to veterinarians that haven't really thought about it? How do you define what culture you want to be in? And then how do you ask right questions?
And I just want to build on it too, Stacy. Are they looking for that, or is that what retains people?
Right.
So yes, veterinarians are looking for a great company culture. I mean, they're looking for other things too. They're looking for a work-life balance. They're looking for more paid time off, more flexible working hours, better benefits, more accessible health insurance. Things are nice to have like 401k plans, continuing education. But I think the most important thing is company culture because people go to work and they want to have fun. They want to enjoy the work. They want to enjoy the people that they're working with. It doesn't. Have you ever seen the movie The Firm with Tom Cruise? Where he's a lawyer and he goes and takes the highest compensation and he goes to work as a lawyer for a firm that's owned by the mafia, and it's a terrible culture and a terrible work environment. Somebody made a comment early in my career. They said, yeah, you could go take the highest salary, with the mafia, but you're going to be, miserable and in a terrible work environment. So, it's not always the company that provides the highest salary has the best work culture. So you have to consider those things. But how do you know during an interview process if an employer has a good company culture? Well, you observe. You spend time there, you ask good questions, get references if you know people that work there or people that have worked there. You can look at online reviews, but just ask the right questions and spend enough time in the environment observing how people interact with one another, and how they treat one another. And also, too, how they treat you during the interview process. Because, if you show up on time and the employer is late, if the employer is not engaged and focused on you and making you a priority to ask the right questions and let you ask the right questions, you're going to observe things about the culture as you're going through the interview process.
Yeah, that's totally true. So I got a maybe a wildly different question, which is how do the independent veterinarians compete with corporate when we're talking about all of these things? 401k, defined company culture. Is it a totally unfair playing field? And what do you think the future of the independent veterinary practice is, Stacy?
Well, my comment on that is, and let me give an example. Well, before I give an example, let me say that you have to look at everything that you're doing. You asked at the beginning of the conversation, what are we doing to compete in this market? And, one of the things that we're doing is we're looking at everything we're doing, such as evaluating our systems and our processes and how we're doing everything. And are we doing everything, the best way that we possibly can? I think you really have to refine your approach and look at all your things and how you're doing them. And so, one of the things is professionalism. And let me give you my example. Just yesterday, we had one of our candidates was interviewing with one of our clients for a position for an associate veterinarian. And our client was using all of these pet names in the interview, like Honey and Sweetie and Hun, and to this female veterinarian, and she got very offended. I don't blame her, and said, "I don't want to, work for somebody that's going to refer to me as Sweetie and Honey when I'm a doctor." And so I had to give that feedback to my client. It was, an uncomfortable thing to have to bring up and, mention to my client, but I did. And so now they know. And so now they're, hopefully not going to do that again. We had another client about 2 years ago that was bringing, independent practice, was bringing a veterinarian in from out of state to come and interview at their practice. And the practice owner told her he was going to put her up in a hotel. And when she got to the airport, he said, "Well, you can just stay at my house." Well, you can imagine she decided not to go to the interview. She said, "I'm certainly not going to stay at his house." I don't blame her. This person was a stranger. So things like that are just, they're, you think, that common sense, somebody's not going to do that. But some people, he thought, "Oh, I'm just being a good host and just, I'll let her stay at my house." So you really have to look at everything that you're doing and make sure that you're being professional and that you're providing the best experience possible to this person that you're trying to hire.
It's interesting because right now, as we're building out the Galaxy Vets, I'm going through a lot of this transition thinking of more sort of a corporate thinking, and some of these things are difficult to me. But things like the, stay at my house and things like that, they're definitely not something that I would go even past my filter these days. So it's interesting how in the bigger companies you would have more chiseled sort of equality. There's higher bar for these things, the non-harassment environment and things like that. So this is very important. Even like quality of pay, where there is a tremendous disparate pay gaps between the different, gender, and anyway, there's all kinds of stuff that vets just don't see, and we're seeing it now. So it's interesting for me to learn. We're nearing the end, but I wanted to add a couple of things that came to mind when you were talking about the culture, because a couple of things that I find that I give advice to not only veterinarians but even to, as we work with the Ukrainians that are coming into the country, when you're going through an interview, don't be afraid. You're interviewing an employer as much or more, especially if you're a veterinarian, than they're interviewing you. You have the full right to ask. Don't just try to show that you have surgical skills, experience, internship. Ask them, how do you deal with euthanasias? What if client can't pay? What do you do? What if I have to stay after hours to write medical records? Can I do it from home? Like things that are closer to the culture. And then if someone says we're all about work-life balance, ask them, how do you measure that? If someone says we're doing something deliberately and intentional, how do you measure success in what you do? And I think that that is very important. That's what I found with a lot of consolidators before we pivoted, is that Everybody says we're all about work-life balance, but nobody has any idea how to measure that and then to show that that actually does happen. Another thing is ask them, how do you measure my success? How do you tell if I'm succeeding in my job or not? Because if it's all about the dollars amount of blood works and x-rays done, then maybe that's not the culture that you want to be in. There's specific questions that you can ask to drive this and to understand your employer. And in this market of not enough veterinarians, we definitely have an upper hand as veterinarians to ask these questions from the employers. We are up on time, and as usual, it ran through very quickly. We have two questions that we ask at the end. Stacy, do you have a book, a TED Talk, a YouTube video that you would recommend to our listeners to explore?
I do. The book that I would recommend is The Success Principles by Jack Canfield. It's a long book, it's several hundred pages, but there's so many good nuggets that will help you be more successful in both your career and in your life in general.
That's great, Stacy. Thanks so much. And yeah, thanks for such an engaging and fact-filled episode of the podcast. It was great to catch up with you again. Last question we like to ask all of our guests is another innovator, someone in your network in the veterinary industry that you think we should have on the show.
I think Dr. Audrey Weistrich with Pet Folk is innovator and on cutting edge with technology.
Thank you so much for listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast. If you want to hear about our new episodes, please follow us on any social media channel. Also, you can check out our website at veterinaryin.to. See you next week.